Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethos Online. Again, this is a space where we can be, belong, and become the very best version of ourselves. So, again, wherever you are, wherever you're joining us from right now, again, whether that's on your sofa or driving into work, we just want to say welcome, and we're so grateful you're joining us again. And so, a reminder for anyone joining us for the first time or anyone who's just been along for the whole journey here at Ethos, just a reminder, this is what we do. We study Torah in depth. We take a lot of deep, difficult journeys into the words, into the audience, into the actual context of every word, every phrase, every sentence we find. We go a little bit, actually a lot deeper than most do today. And so that's again why we feel this is such an important study. Most people are not taking the time that we do. And so this is why, again, we're so excited to offer this to you every single week, this deeper study into the Bible. And so today, again, a reminder, we are moving through the book of Genesis. A beautiful book, the book of Genesis, the idea of origins, right? But a deeper picture, not just the beginning of all things, right? This was much bigger than that for Israel. It was actually their very identity. This is who we are. And so in the middle of captivity, while they are in Babylonian captivity, 587 BC, they're putting together all their stories, all their tradition, all their ritual, and they're saying, we want to hold on to this. We don't want to assimilate like all the other tribes. We want to be Jewish. We want to stay Jewish. We want to keep Judaism kosher, right? And so this is the reason behind compiling Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Torah, all of that in the first place. That is the reason, not to write a perfectly historically accurate history of their tribe. That was never the point. The point was, again, to ensure that these future generations, they have the stories, right? They have a reminder of this is who we are and this is who we aren't. And so it's really a beautiful gift. Torah is a beautiful gift for the Jewish nation. And so for us today, we're not Jewish. Most of us joining here on Ethos, this might be a surprise to you, most of us are not Jewish. And so what we do is we say, if this is written by Jewish people, then we should respect that it was Jewish. We should understand a good amount about Judaism. We should understand that it wasn't written in English, it was in Hebrew. And so we take time to understand who wrote it, why they wrote it. And afterwards, then we can make an application to today, but only after we do the difficult work. And so today we do what we always do, right? We delve into Genesis. We ask deeper questions of the verses and the words. And so today we're on chapter 36, and 36 was an interesting one for me. Most of the time I give you about 10, 11 verses, and that's about it, because there's just so much rich depth there. And it's difficult to go too many verses in, right? Because there's so much there to unpack when you've got 8 to 11 verses. But today, chapter 36 is a really fascinating one. And I would argue, again, very easy to skip over. Because whenever you get into these chronologies, whenever you get into these lists of names and places, it seems a little boring. And again, I would argue it seems boring to us in 2022, right? It's boring to us because these names don't mean anything to us. The places mentioned don't mean a lot to us. The interesting, weird metaphor thrown in the middle, not very interesting to us because we are not Jewish, right? But for the people reading this, 587, just post 587 BC, when they are reading this, when the Jewish individuals, the Hebrew tribe Israel, when they are reading this, they're seeing things we don't. And so today, I'm going to move through the whole chapter. We're going to go through the whole thing because it's not as detailed as one might think. However, there's an interesting pattern here. And when you understand the pattern of it, the whole thing pops. But if you were just to dissect it like 10 verses in, 10 verses, it would get a little confusing. It would. We would miss the bigger picture. So I'm going to do the difficult work today. I'm going to try to delve into the whole thing. I'm going to skip over little bits here and there, but I'm going to read through it with you in its entirety. But I'm going to show you the deeper patterns put into this, and then move through what these names mean, why the names are in the order they're in, all of that. I'm even going to show you an interesting, odd metaphor, a metaphorical story that many people kind of scratch their head with. And so I'm going to do that with you. So let's delve in. But before we do, I want you to understand one thing. I'm going to read this big list. And so, again, on the surface, it's going to seem boring, but I want you to know this. It's a list of kings from other tribes. So, with that context, understand this. Israel is saying there are all these other kings, and these kings were horrible. Israel, don't be horrible like these other kings. That is the basic message of the entire chapter 36. Israel, don't let your Jewish leaders, don't let your kings look like this. If you're gonna have a king, if you're gonna demand a king, then may your kings have substance. May your kings have values and ethics. May your kings be good kings. And this is what chapter 36 is really all about. It's saying this is what other tribes had. And this is what we choose to have in our leaders. These are the values and the ethics we feel our leaders should hold up. And so it's going to be a lot of compare and contrast. And so here we go. Let's read. I'm going to go through the verses with you in just the first slide, and then we'll touch on some of the highlighted, colored ones that I have here for you. So here we go. Verse 1. And these are the generations of Esau. So Esau, here he is again, right? What happened to Esau? Well, here is what happened to Esau, right? Here, it was all about Jacob for a while. We're going to remind you of who and what happened to Esau. So these are the generations of Esau that reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over Israel. So you get a little bit of backstory, right? This is the idea here. They're trying to remind you, hey, before Israel was Israel, before we had kings, there were all these other kings, right? Kind of like it's building up an epic story for you. This is the idea. Esau took his wives from the daughters of Canaan, Adah, daughter of Elon the Hittite. There are a lot of interesting names here. And Oholibamah, that's an interesting word, daughter of Anah, daughter of Zebon, the Hivite. Also, Basemath, daughter of Ishmael, sister of Nebaioth. Adah bore Eliphaz, and Esau and Basemath bore Reuel. The O word there bore Jeush and Jalem and Korah. These are the sons of Esau who were born to him in the land of Canaan. Now, those are some big names, right? So hard that it's difficult to pronounce, especially for a speaker when they're moving through this. But check this out. First off, Adah. We have this name here, the daughter Adah of Elon the Hittite. So understand this. Every word, every name is going to have something interesting about it. And I'm going to choose to try to pull from different rabbinical interpretations that found meaning here. I'm not going to touch on every single name, but you'll get the idea. Adah, she was known for burning incense. So it's an interesting idea here. The pattern throughout this whole chapter of 36 is going to be this. You're going to have a name come up, and for the next 4 to 6 verses or so, it's going to follow the idea. So the name is going to give you an idea, and then all the other names and tribes all flow with that same idea. They're all going to be words that are synonymous, very similar to that first word. And of course, they're going to be connected to kings. So this one, Adah, she is known for burning incense to other gods. So essentially, she's known for wanting power, and she's trying to find power through idolatry. So we started out with there's this leader, right, that is very idolatrous. Idolatry. There's this leader that's attempting to gain power through finding value in other things apart from the divine. I like what Aaron Jeffrey says, one historian. He says this about the idea of idolatry, because I think we get this idea very confused sometimes. We get this idea that idolatry is only like having a wooden figure and worshiping that. But idolatry goes deeper. Understand this. The issue of idolatry was less concerned with worship, but alignment of values. When one worshiped idols as a Jew, one was placing their values and ethics with the God they worshiped. So understand this about these leaders here, these women. They're all of these women are all point to the dangers of leaders misaligning power with the wrong ethics and values. So understand this as a Jewish person, when you see this name first, this idea of the person, this individual who is constantly worshiping idols, it immediately makes the connection that when a leader has displaced ethics and values, we end up with some pretty dangerous policies, don't we? I think all of us can connect to that on some degree, whether, again, politically or you are right or left, wherever you fall, whatever business you're in, you know this to be true. When your leaders have displaced values and ethics, when they're willing to skim off the top, when they do these things, it may benefit them and a very elite small group for a while, but everyone suffers at some point because those values were so misplaced. And so from the beginning, we have this individual, Adah, who reminds us that when leadership goes the wrong direction, when leadership misaligns their ethics and their power, when they begin worshiping self, the people suffer. And so that list, what you have in that list, if you look back here, in that list 1 through 5, all of these names are synonymous with the idea of worshiping self and misaligning values. It's so interesting. So again, 1 through 5, these words, these names all have connection with idolatry. So if you're reading this and the question is, what does a good Jewish leader not do? Well, a good Jewish leader does not have misplaced ethics. A good Jewish leader will have values that are aligned with his people, and they will work on helping their people as a whole through everything they do. So whatever policy they push, whatever reform they're doing, whatever taxes they're doing on the people, whatever it is, it's for the betterment of the people, and it aligns with the values that they have. Really pretty beautiful. Yeah, you're beginning to see it. There's a pattern here, and it's a really cool one. Let's keep going. Verses 8 through 10, there is another pattern that emerges. There's another whole message now in these verses. So watch this. Esau took his wives, his sons, and his daughters, and all the people of his household, and his cattle, and all his animals, and all his property that he had acquired in the land of Canaan, right, the place of plenty. And he went to another land because of his brother Jacob. Now, it almost seems as if these two are at odds, right? But understanding a Hebrew tribal person, they understand they're not at odds. They're not at odds. Look at this. For their possessions were too numerous for them to dwell together. And the land of those sojournings could not support them because of their livestock. So understand the idea here. It's a very tribal one, right? When resources are scarce, when you have too many people, there needs to be movement. There needs to be some separation, right? And so when a tribe understands this, they deeply respect each other's need for space. This idea of learning to separate when it's time to separate. Resources are not always plentiful everywhere when you have that many people. Sometimes a group splits up. I know a church right now. They're booming. They're getting so big. And they had a meeting where they literally said, look, we're so big. It's almost too much. And I think it's time to split. Usually you hear a lot of churches, they just want bigger and bigger and bigger, right? They just start building bigger and bigger rooms and bigger auditoriums and 20 services. This church follows a very biblical tribal idea. When it gets too big, you split, right? You split the group. Not that there's conflict or any of that, but you understand that once it gets too big, well, the people's needs are no longer able to be met. That happens in a spiritual way. That also happens with resources with a tribal people as well. What an interesting idea. Especially, again, this is a message to leaders, right? This is a message to kings. Maybe sometimes bigger is not always better. And so Esau and Jacob, good leaders, understood there needed to be a split, right? They needed to separate for a time. Notice this, Mount Seir. I just, again, think this is so fun. Many people, again, will try to make this literal, right? This whole story, they'll try to literalize it. Please don't. Right? Look at the funny irony, the funny elements of the story. Every name has a meaning, right? When they're reading this, they saw Mount Seir. They saw Esau, the shaggy one. It comes from where? Well, the shaggy place, the shaggy forest, right? It's funny. It's cute. There's metaphor here. They are playing with the reader, right? They're making all these funny innuendos. They're trying to pull you along with a deeper picture, right? And so as you're reading, you begin to see it and you can kind of smile as you move through it. And so notice this. The sons of Eliphaz were Teman, Omar, Zepho, Gatam, and Kenaz. And Timon was a concubine to Eliphaz, son of Esau, and she bore to Eliphaz Amalek. These are the sons of Adah, the wife of Esau. And these are the sons of Reuel, Nahath, Zerath, Shammah, and Mizah. This is so fun to me to try to say these names. It's worth it just to watch this, to hear me try to pronounce these names. These are the sons of Basemath, the wife of Esau. And these are the sons of Ohumabalah, daughter of Anah, daughter of Zibeon, the wife of Esau. She bore Esau, Jeush, Jalam, and Korah. These became the chieftains of the sons of Esau, the sons of Eliphaz, Esau's firstborn, chief Timon, chief Omar, chief Zepho, chief Kenaz. Right? Okay, so we just got through a bunch of names. There is an interesting interpretation on this one. This idea of Timah. Timah is a concubine. There's a little bit of a narrative here. There's an interesting lesson here in these 5 verses about Timah. And so there's some interesting history that you might miss if you're not Jewish. And so reading along with the Jewish sages, this is what they say about Timah. When a Jewish person read the name Timah, they immediately thought of the story. There was context here that we don't have. And so let me read to you this from one of our great rabbis. He says this: Timnah wanted to convert to Judaism and marry Eliphaz. This is Rashi, of course. She came to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they would not accept her. So Timnah could only be a concubine to Eliphaz, and she didn't become Jewish. One of her descendants was Amalek, who attacked the Jewish people in later generations, kind of a bloodbath. Why did this happen? That's what Rashi asks. Why does this happen? Because the patriarch should not have rejected Timnah. The Torah lesson is always to encourage conversion to Judaism, even if it is initially due just to a desire to marry and unify a family. We talked about this in earlier chapters, right? But conversion, the Jews felt Judaism was a gift to the world, right? It was a religion that essentially was moving toward peace, fullness, shalom, right? And so it's a blessing they desire to give. And if they refuse to give it to someone, then there are curses that follow, is the idea here, right? Had they accepted her, she would have been a blessing. She would have been part of the family. But because they push her out, they make her an other. Later on in history, it is her people that attack them and hurt them deeply. Right? And so it's an interesting little point here. Make an enemy your friend. Right? There's this little pop here with almost every single rabbi I've read. They bring up this point. If only Judaism at this moment, if only Israel had said, we must make an enemy a friend here, Israel would have avoided some violence. Right? Good leaders seek to make enemies friends. This was something that, again, for a king to hear at this point in time would have been kind of earth-shattering. All the other tribes, great leaders are violent leaders. They conquer neighbors. Israel's saying, no. What if our kings were a different kind of king? What if our leaders were a different kind of leader? What if our leaders sought to make enemies friends? Right? What an interesting trajectory. Yeah, it's so fascinating to me. So many interesting elements about what a king should be and what a king shouldn't be. There's more. Verse 16. Chief Korah, Chief Gatam, Chief Amalek, these are the chieftains of Eliphaz in the land of Edom. These are the sons of Adah. And these are the sons of Reuel, the sons of Esau, Chief Nahath, Chief Zerath, lots of chiefs here. These are the chieftains of Reuel in the land of Edom. These are the sons of Basemath, the wife of Esau. These are the sons of... So you get the idea here, right? Lots of chieftains, lots of names. These chiefs, understand this, when you look at this list of these different chiefs, which I'm not going to read right now, these chiefs were absolute pains to Israel. When you look at who these people were, they were deeply violent. They attacked Israel at like every juncture in the story, constantly. Israel, though, they again are learning to be more peaceful than violent to their neighbors. So the idea here, they're kind of comparing and contrasting. While Israel's being called to a deeper ethic, their kings and the neighboring kings, they continue to get more and more violent, right? They continue to go down a worse and worse path. So a compare and a contrast right there. The more violent kings, the chieftains are extremely violent. And because of that, it only begets more violence and more violence. One writer says this: the chieftains of Eliphaz are examples to Israel of how power can often corrupt kings. When kings seek only power, their people and their neighbors take the brunt of the violence that is sure to ensue. So again, seek peace over violence, Israel, right? It's the message of Torah. It's the message of Jesus. It's a message I would argue is extremely important right here in 2022. Seek peace over violence. Seek peace over angry rhetoric. Seek peace over attempting to take others' resources. Find a way to seek peace first. This, again, would have been such an odd idea for so many of these tribal warring people, right? But Israel, again, on a different ethic. So good. Yeah. Verses 21 through 23, check this out. Dishan, Ezer, and Dishan, these are the chieftains of the Horites. So again, notice this. They're bringing up all these different tribes, all these different chieftains, right? That all came from, of course, Esau. So these are the chieftains of the Horites, the sons of Seir in the land of Edom. The sons of Lotan were Hori and Heman, and the sister of Lotan was Timnah. So Timnah kind of pops up again. And these are the sons of Shabol, Elvan, Manathath, and Ebal, Shepho, and Onam. How'd I do with that one? A little bit better, yeah. Horite. So again, the first real tribe here in the next section, the Horites. Who are they? Interesting. When you say the word in the Hebrew, it means someone who dwells in the dark in a cave. Right? If you want to call your enemies anything, think about this. They're basically saying you are cave dwellers, right? You're cavemen. You live in the dark, right? Horites. Here's what one interpretation says. Horites are the cave dwellers, the kings of the past that lived in darkness. Their rule was one of violence and corruption, not knowing right from wrong, bringing dark days to not only neighboring tribes, but their own. Want to know what a king should be or shouldn't be? You shouldn't be a cave dweller, right? We've seen this with kings and leaders before, haven't we? Hitler, think about Hitler, right? Hitler brings so much darkness, not only to his people in Germany and to the Jewish people there, but to the world, right? He was the ultimate cave dweller, right? Dwelled in darkness. A king should not dwell in darkness, but dwell in the light. Right? Find ways to constantly immerse themselves in goodness, not darkness, not hate. Right? If your king's message, if your leader's message are all about marginalizing, making divisions between people, if that's the message of your king, your leader, your president, then they are cave dwellers, according to the Hebrews. And let's be honest, in America, we have had lots of cave dwellers over the past couple of years, haven't we? Yeah, over the last 10, 20 years, lots of cave dwellers. It's just unfortunate. Yeah, no matter which side you're on, lots of cave dwellers. 24 through 26. Here's another section about the elements of a good king versus a bad king. And these are the sons of Zibeon. So now we're looking at Zibeon, and we're going to have a list of names. Ea and Anah, he is Anah who found the mules in the wilderness when he pastured the donkeys for his father Zibeon. And these are the sons of Anah, Dishan, Ohinabana, and the son of Anah. These are the sons of Dishan, Himedin, Eshban, Ithran, and Sharon. So notice this. Here's another weird, odd story, odd element within this list. Notice this. Very rare, actually, for in a Hebrew writing to have a list of names, but then have a short little narrative in the middle. Very rare, only happens twice in the Old Testament, where you have this list, but then a little story tucked in. So notice this weird little gem, this odd little story. Ea and Anah, he is Anah who found the mules. So there's this dude finds mules in the wilderness. He pastures the donkeys for his father Zibeon. So the interesting Jewish tradition here is this. Check out this picture, right? We have horses, we have donkeys. So apparently, they're in the Midrash, right? These deeper stories behind the stories. Apparently, there's the story of Anah, who is basically the one who creates the first mule. It's so weird. It's so odd, but you'll get the picture in a moment. For us, it's weird, right? Oh, that's where mules come from, right? This is for us, we would say something funny like that. But literally, the idea here is she takes a horse, she takes a donkey, and she gets a mule, right? And so for us, on the surface, we'd say, okay, cool. That they're trying to say that's where mules come from, right? But there's something bigger here. It's not just about the origins of the mule. That's not the point at all. For them, they're essentially saying, look, horses are the more powerful one, right? Donkeys are the more simple creature used for work, right? They're talking about Israel and their neighbors, right? This is what they're doing here. They're kind of creating the horse and the donkey, the asses, the good, the Israel, and the Babylonians. Do you guys see it? And so notice this, what this writer says about this. The story of Anah is the story of Israel and the deeper warning of the intermarriage between Israel and its neighboring tribes. It is also the deep warnings to kings with too high an esteem of themselves. So notice this again. Israel sees themselves as the horses, their neighboring tribes, their enemies as donkeys. It's a funny negative shot, right? It's a shot at them. But what happens again with this idea of intermarriage, when the two values are just joined, well, you create like an interesting animal, don't you? Yeah, you get this mule. And notice what one individual says about mules. I looked all over for like what an expert would say about a mule. I found this, and this was interesting to me. Mules, while smarter, are often the most difficult to train and disobedient to trail rides, yet can traverse mountain paths far better than that of the trail horse. So again, notice this. I don't think it's a stretch. The idea here, the mule is strong, but it's disobedient, right? And these tribal people, they would have known that. They had mules, right? They're hard to train, right? Do you know any leaders like this? Yeah, I love this so much. Do you know any of the leaders that are more mule-like than horse-like? Or they're more mule-like than the hard-working donkey? Right? You have the one leader that is an extremely good leader, follows values, graceful, all these things. Or then you have the other leader that's always doing the hard work. They're stacking the chairs, they're doing all that. And then you have that other one, the mule, the one that's so headstrong, unwilling to listen, right? Unwilling to consider counter perspectives. There's the mule. Right? And so what an interesting perspective here of what a king, if you have a mule as a king, you have a strong-willed, passionate, really headstrong individual who may bring a lot of pain and brokenness to your empire. Yeah, and I think we can think of some leaders that have looked that way too, haven't we? Yeah, I think so. Let's move on. 27 through 32, more interesting elements of leaders and kings. So these are the sons of Ezer, Bilhan, Zavan, and Akan. These are the sons of Dishan, Uz, and Aram. These are the chieftains of the Horites, and we'll get into that in a minute. But notice this, Ezer. The word Ezer is actually a positive name, and it means to help. So you have all these like really painfully bad kings all throughout, and then you have this one bright moment, this one bright king who actually was a pretty decent king, who was helpful to the other nations. That's why his name is helpful, right? But notice this, the individuals that follow, his sons. It's interesting. The course sometimes the children, the generations after, they don't always follow in the footprints of good leaders, do they? And so you have this, the sons of Ezer, literally, Bilhah is foolish, Zavan, trembling terror. Like, think about as a leader, trembling terror, Akan, no substance. You could easily say the last three presidents we've had, we could fit them into this role at some point, or these different names. Trembling terror, I can think of one that looked like that. No substance, I can think of one right now that looks like that. It's interesting, right? One historian says this about this idea. When kings don't pass on wisdom, the next leaders will become weak links that often destroy a nation. That's fascinating, isn't it? So notice this. All of these names here, I'll go back. All these names here following. After a generation loses that helpfulness, those positive traits, they begin to weaken. And so the other names that follow, you'll have laughing hyena. One of the names laughing hyena, a joke, basically. Weak-minded one. I think you get the point here, right? Weak kings create weaker nations, weaker generations, weaker leaders follow. That's the idea here they're trying to share. 33 through 37. Here's another picture. And this one was a bit heavy. So keep with me here. I know we're kind of treading along. We're reading a lot of names, but I think you're getting it, right? Now, this section is going to bring up another attribute of what a poor leader looks like, so that Israel might understand a good one. So here we go. We start with Bela. The word Bela means to the devourer. Yeah, the devourer. So think about this kind of king. Think about this one. One that devours other nations. All the other names following this through 37 are essentially really negative connotations of what it means to take what is not yours. So King, Bela, right? Bela, the devourer. It makes me think of John, right? John the Revelator. He speaks of these nations in much the same way, right? He describes them as these hungry beasts. These pictures right here, I know you've seen them before. He describes them as like these beastly empires that just devour and conquer and destroy, right? They enslave people. They steal the resources of all these nations. It's Rome, it's Babylon, it's Egypt, it's Greece, right? It's Persia. It's all of these nations, these beastly nations that just devour. And what Israel's saying here is, look, that's what those kings look like. We feel our kings should not just be devouring. Our kings should actually be giving. Our kings should not be so intent on building bigger and bigger and bigger. Our kings should be finding ways to spread the empire here, right? Create kingdom of heaven here, shalom here, so shalom spreads. Not the kingdom's wealth, but shalom spreads. It's not devouring, it's actually filling. It's a difference, right? And it's a beautiful one. And so Israel's learning this. When I thought about Rome, when I thought about Egypt, when I thought about Babylon, I thought about this. Most of those emperors, most of those leaders, they did any devouring nation that was mainly militaristic, the emperors didn't last long. I looked at Rome. Rome is like the militaristic empire of all empires. Notice what one historian says about Rome. Well over half of the emperors of Rome met some form of premature and violent end. With the average reign, this blew my mind, I didn't even realize this, the average reign lasting only 8 years throughout the history of the empire. 8 years. That's it. And then the king was dead. 8 years. You had 8 years and you were toast. You got there by devouring. And because of that, you too will be devoured. You got there because of violence and you will meet a violent end. Think about what that is saying to a leader, a king of an empire or a nation. If you got here through violence, then violence will be your end. If you got here through any kind of means that was following removing ethic and virtue and value, then that's how you're going to meet your end. Your reign will end. That's the picture here. It's sad, but it's true, right? The devourer will be devoured, and we know this historically over and over again. Let's keep going. Notice this, and Jabab. Other names, again, with this idea, Jabab, crying in pain. Hadad, thunderer, right? The thunder falls on one. The problems follow. All of these names are going to fit with this idea of devour until you hit Saul. Saul, notice this, verse 38. Saul is a positive note. Paul is the upswing. When things have collapsed, there's an upswing. And so for Saul, Saul means to be dedicated to God. Saul is to be dedicated. But when dedication dies, notice this, because again, they're talking about tribes. They're talking about kings that have passed on before them, their neighboring tribes, what not to do. When dedication to God dies, when you've been on the upswing, but dedication to God dies, what do you suppose happened next? Well, it's a repeat, isn't it? Notice this. And Baal Hanan, son of Agar, reigned in his stead. Baal, right? Baal, meaning the Lord is gracious. The Lord God, Baal, right? The idol is gracious to you. So we just went right back to idol worship, right? Self-worship. And notice this, 39. This is essentially the end. Verse 39, they went through all of these sections of what the attributes of poor kings look like, bad kings. We just went through, and eventually, notice this, when we get right back to idol worship, when we get back to worship of self, when an empire begins to focus in instead of out, inward instead of outward, the whole thing collapses again. This is the deeper warning to Israel. Right? When it becomes so inwardly focused, you no longer spread shalom, right? You build an empire. If you build it on what I get, on me, devour, build, when you build it on that, it eventually collapses, doesn't it? When you build it on spreading shalom, it continues on into eternity. That's the idea. It made me think about this. The 8 phases of empire. That verse 39 there, it reminded me of this. Historians say this. Empires, they go through phases. Some say 5, some say 8. I think I gravitate more toward the 8. And it says this. Empires, typically, you have the pioneers, then you have the soldiers, then you have the merchants, the businessmen, the intellectuals. This is all about building, right? Expanding. But notice this. When idolatry happens, when you begin to have the intellectuals, the athletes, the musicians, the actors, when they become the leaders and the kings of an empire, we know historically, Rome, Greece, Babylon, every one of them, they went through this idea here, this same cycle. And when self became the focus, when it became an inward focus, every single time the empire fell. So what is the deeper message to Israel? Let's live outwardly. Let's help others so that that inward journey reflects the out rather than take it all in, build up on what I want, my needs, devour. What an interesting twist on leadership. And then so you'll notice verses 40 through 43, basically what this is, it's a common Jewish writing style. They basically are just summing up and they're organizing it all back together. And they're saying, so in summation, right? In summary, here are the tribes, here are the clans. And that's kind of what they do. They basically say, here's how the thing ends, right? Here's how we organize it all back together. Here's how we sum it up. And so as leaders, we don't have to follow the past examples, right? We have to be aware of them, though, don't we? I thought a lot about this. Israel is spending it's an entire chapter. It's an entire chapter that we usually skip over. But what Israel's doing for their leaders here and their people is saying, look, you have to take time to remember what poor leadership does. Because if we don't take time to remember that, we are going to repeat it, aren't we? We have to remember those characteristics so we don't see our kings, our presidents, our leaders doing the same thing. Because if they do, the whole thing is heading toward collapse. Here's some people I want you to meet, just for fun. This is William Tweed. William M. Tweed became a member of the New York State Senate 1868, and he oversaw basically a whole group of politicians. What we found out later is they were extremely corrupt politicians. He was like the original gangster of corrupt politicians. And so what he did, basically, he stole tons of money, political money. He basically was convicted of stealing money, making profit off of the government. And so William Tweed is probably one of the worst, the OG of political corruptness. Started there in New York. Here's another one. Catholic Church, we know, has been rocked by really poor leadership in the past, right? There have been good ones, there have been bad ones, and this is the ugly, right? We've seen this. Bishop Brugus, Roger Van Woon, he is especially troubling to me. 2010, we found out this bishop basically was sexually molesting tons of kids, even his own 15-year-old nephew. He was later taken and imprisoned. It's terrible, right? And so we had corruption, and now we have the abuse of children. We have seen leadership misuse its power, haven't we? And the question, of course, is, have we learned? Let me introduce you to more. 2013, Detroit Mayor Kwame M. Kilpatrick. He was known as the the crime boss. They called him the crime boss mayor. And so basically, this guy, he was convicted of 24 different federal felonies, ranging from extortion to mail fraud. He actually had a prostitute that he was seen murdered just to keep his name clean. So again, we have seen really, really poor leadership in our past. Wouldn't it be interesting if we said, look, we want a mayor who is not getting paid by any second parties. We want a mayor who's making this salary. And at the end of the tax season, we'll see he's not made anything more than that because he's not taken anything from anyone. Wouldn't that be interesting if we learned from the past from people like Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick? Wouldn't that be interesting? Another politician that has misused their power recently during a time when his city needed him most. Let me introduce you to Mayor Ray Nagin. He was convicted of 20 charges for bribery, wire fraud, money laundering, all when basically New Orleans was underwater. When they needed him the most, he took off to Hawaii with his family. Yeah, there are tons of poor leadership all throughout our country's history, all throughout the world's history, right? Stalin, Hitler, we've got Ivan the Terrible, we've got Mao, we've got all these people, all these examples of what not to do. And I would argue we don't forget these people. That's why Israel wrote them down. They said it is still important to remember these people. We don't whitewash history. We look back and we remember these people. We remember where we should not head, right? And we remember those qualities so that we might have different qualities as leaders. I think about our past presidents. I think about President Trump. Yes, our economy did great, but wow, the media, the narcissism, all of it, often making a mockery of the presidential position. It was tough, right? We have President Trump. We have Obama. An incredible speaker, ended up bombing Syria to the cave age, right? We have Bush, who many thought was a fantastic leader, but at the same time took us to war in Iraq for weapons that weren't even there, right? We have Clinton, who again would often he would cross the aisle and work together, and yet he was doing all of these perverse sexual things in the White House. So many things we can learn from leadership: what to do, what not to do. And this is why we don't whitewash over it. We choose to remember it, learn from it, and then beg our leaders to stand at a higher, deeper value than the past. Whew. It has been 45 minutes, folks. I'm going to push ahead. I want to get to the let's take it home because this was a lot of fun for me. I wanted to read this before I stepped in. We must learn from the leaders of the past in order to build responsible leaders for the future. We have to take time to remember the positive and the negative qualities, just like Israel did in chapter 36. So the question I started thinking about was, what can we do? What can we apply from this message? And so for me, I started thinking about, how have I dealt with those kind of leaders in chapter 36? When have I been that leader? Right? And I thought maybe some of you right now, you're working in positions where you're having to deal with maybe some toxic leadership. And so I started thinking, what would I do if I was back in that place? Or if I had to deal with me when I was toxic at various points in my leadership skills? So here's some ideas I wanted to toss at you before we end to maybe consider as you're dealing with these kind of leaders. Number one, help instead of judge. It's so easy to sit back and judge, right? I made all these judgments on those four presidents and others. It's the easiest thing to do, to judge. But to step in and say, how can I be helpful, right? What can I do instead of just sitting back? Oftentimes those leaders are anxious, right? They're terrified to lose their position. What can I do to help them? Maybe if I helped, maybe if I stepped in and offered some kind of help, maybe it would lessen that toxicity. Maybe. Number two, control reactions. Try your best not to react, right? I think for many of us, when there's toxicity, when leadership is just abysmal, they're mean, they're doing those things, often a reaction from us, one that's sporadic, spontaneous, it will often, it'll cause us to be at odds with them, first off, but it'll also make that issue bigger and bigger and bigger. And you become making an enemy rather than aligning and working together. Number three, document everything. This is a safeguard that I wanted to share with you. Whenever I've worked with someone that I've thought, man, I think this is going to end poorly, I always document. I always keep emails. And here's the beauty of it. Israel is doing this in chapter 36, aren't they? They document everything. And you might find yourself years later reading over some of that and saying, oh, I'm so grateful for where I am now. And I can tell you, I'm in that space. I'm working at a school where I have never worked with the kind of administration that loves and supports their staff the way this one does. And I documented past ones, and I look over those now, and I'm like, oh, I am so grateful for where I am now. Number four, set boundaries. If the leadership is toxic, set those boundaries. Set those boundaries to keep yourself safe. You're not going to be there forever. They won't be a leader forever if they're toxic, right? Their leadership is only going to last so long. And so you set those safeties because you are there for the long run, right? You are there because you want to stick with it. You believe in the thing. You believe in the cause. You believe in the tribe. And so set those boundaries. Keep yourself safe. And then the last one, clarify. Ask lots of clarifying questions. Make sure you're not just putting on them that label of toxicity without really understanding. Take time to clarify what the need is, why they're doing it, and sometimes it might surprise you. You can give them the benefit of the doubt too. Everyone, thank you so much for sharing all of that with me today. We went 50 minutes. I know we went through a whole chapter. My voice is almost gone, but this was so good, so heavy, so in depth. I hope you enjoyed it. We really put a lot out there for you this week. As always, please consider going to ethos-church.org/donate. Again, we're a tax-deductible donation. We thrive on your donations. It keeps what we do going. As always, if you want to join us live, Ethos Living Rooms, would love to see you there. And hit that subscribe button, share that YouTube channel. We want to keep growing. We're getting more views, but we want to see it really start to grow soon. I know once Genesis is finished and we share that playlist, it really will begin to boom even more. But for now, let's keep sharing it and let's get people involved now before we put out that big playlist. So everyone, thank you so much. I love you. Can't wait to see you next week when we delve into chapter 27. See ya.